Welcome to Tea and Clues, where every story unfolds like a warm cup of tea with a dash of mystery. Step into a world of gentle detective tales, charming villages, and clever puzzles waiting to be solved. Whether it's a quiet afternoon mystery or a cozy crime to unravel, each story is crafted to intrigue and delight, without the dark, chilling twists of traditional crime stories. What you'll find here: light-hearted yet engaging detective stories, charming villages with hidden secrets, a mix of cozy noir and classic mystery vibes. Stories perfect for relaxing and unwinding. So grab your favorite cup of tea, settle into your favorite chair, and let's uncover clues together, because every mystery deserves a little warmth. Subscribe and join the Tea and Clues Mystery Club today. Chapter 1. The village of St. Mary Mead was accustomed to its fair share of peculiar happenings, though nothing quite as curious as what unfolded at Greythorn House that summer. The old manor, which had stood for centuries on the outskirts of the village, had long been the subject of whispered rumors, tales of lost fortunes, hidden rooms, and long-dead secrets buried beneath its heavy stone walls. It had remained unoccupied for years until, much to everyone's surprise, it was recently inherited by Miss Eleanor Pritchard, a distant relation of the late owner, Colonel Geoffrey Lonsdale. Eleanor had arrived in the village 1 month prior, a quiet and unassuming woman of 35, with a scholarly air and a penchant for old books. She had spoken politely to the villagers, but kept mostly to herself, spending her days sorting through the house's vast collection of artifacts and letters. "She's rather odd, don't you think?" Mrs. Bantry had remarked one afternoon over tea with Miss Marple. Miss Marple, her knitting needles clicking gently, had simply smiled. "Oh, I do not think she is odd, dear. Merely someone accustomed to solitude." But solitude, it seemed, was not the only thing waiting for Eleanor at Greythorn House. The disturbance occurred late one evening. The villagers had already retired for the night when a terrible scream pierced the still air, echoing across the sleepy streets. The next morning, Constable Henry Baker was seen hurrying toward the manor, his expression grim. Mrs. Partridge, Baker's wife, had been out early collecting eggs and had seen him go up. "It's a dreadful business," she told Mrs. Bantry later that morning. "There's been an intruder, they say, or worse." By the time the village had gathered in small clusters near the shops, sharing bits of information, Miss Marple had already heard enough. She took her hat and set off toward Greythorn House. When she arrived, she found Inspector Graves standing at the foot of the grand staircase, his notepad open, looking particularly irritated. The scene before her was rather alarming. The entrance hall was in disarray, papers scattered, furniture slightly askew, and in the middle of it all stood Eleanor Pritchard, pale but composed. "I assure you, Inspector," she was saying, "I heard footsteps in the attic. And then, when I went to check, there was a man. He ran past me, knocked over the table, and disappeared before I could see his face." Inspector Graves frowned deeply. "And you have no idea who it could have been?" Eleanor shook her head. "None. But he was looking for something. I'm certain of it." Miss Marple stepped forward quietly, her keen blue eyes taking in every detail of the scene. "Good morning, dear," she said kindly to Eleanor. "A rather distressing night, I imagine." Eleanor exhaled shakily, as if suddenly aware of the weight of the moment. "Yes, it was terrifying." Miss Marple's gaze drifted toward the staircase, where a faint trail of dust had been disturbed. "Tell me, dear," she said softly, "what exactly is kept in the attic?" Eleanor hesitated. "Old family belongings, trunks, letters, things that haven't been touched in years," Miss Marple nodded. "And yet, someone thought it was worth searching through." She turned back to the inspector. I rather think, dear Inspector, that this is not a simple break-in. Inspector Graves sighed. I was afraid you'd say that, Miss Marple. Miss Marple smiled pleasantly, her fingers tightening just slightly around her handbag. There was something hidden in that attic, and whatever it was, someone was willing to go to great lengths to find it. Chapter 2. The sun had barely risen over St. Mary Mead, yet news of the intruder at Greythorn House had already spread through the village like wildfire. By mid-morning, whispers of buried treasures, hidden wills, and long-forgotten secrets swirled through the tea-rooms and market stalls. Miss Marple, however, paid no mind to speculation. She had always believed that facts were far more interesting than rumors, and, at present, the most intriguing fact was that someone had risked breaking into an abandoned attic in the dead of night. By the time she arrived at Greythorn House, Inspector Graves had taken full control of the investigation, though his frustration was already palpable. "This is turning into a spectacle," he muttered, as Miss Marple entered the drawing-room, where Eleanor Pritchard sat clutching a cup of tea with trembling hands. Miss Marple smiled kindly at the inspector. "Oh, I do hope not, dear. A spectacle tends to distract from the real mystery." Graves scowled, but motioned toward Eleanor. "She says nothing was taken, which means the intruder was either looking for something they didn't find, or they did find it and don't want us to know." Miss Marple turned to Eleanor. "My dear, do forgive the intrusion so early, but I was wondering, when you went up to the attic last night, what exactly did you see?" Eleanor set down her tea, her fingers still unsteady. "It all happened so fast. I heard the footsteps. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, you know. Old places make noise." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. "Yes, dear, but I rather think you knew right away that this was different." Eleanor swallowed hard. Yes, the sound was too deliberate, as if someone was shifting through things, moving carefully. Inspector Graves scribbled in his notebook. "And when you got there?" Eleanor closed her eyes briefly, recalling the moment. "The attic was dark, and I could just make out shadows shifting near an old trunk in the corner. Then, suddenly, the figure bolted past me, knocking over the side table on the landing before disappearing down the back staircase." Miss Marple's eyes sparkled with interest. "How curious! And yet, dear, you say that nothing was stolen?" Eleanor nodded. "Not as far as I can tell." Miss Marple turned to Graves. "Would you be so kind as to take me upstairs, Inspector? I should like to see this attic for myself." Graves sighed but gestured toward the hallway. "Come along, then." The three of them ascended the grand staircase, the wood creaking faintly underfoot. The house had an air of history, of stories left untold, and it was in the dusty attic that those stories seemed to linger most. Eleanor hesitated before opening the door. "I haven't been up here since last night," she admitted. Miss Marple gave a reassuring nod. "Well, dear, let us take a look together." The attic was just as Eleanor had described, filled with old trunks, faded furniture, and shelves lined with books and letters so worn with age they might have crumbled at a touch. But Miss Marple was not interested in the general clutter. She was looking for something specific. Her keen eyes swept the room, taking in the disturbed dust on the floor, the footprints leading to the large wooden trunk in the corner. She moved toward it, placing a gentle hand on the lid. "This was what they were looking through?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes, I found it half open, but I don't know what they wanted." Miss Marple lifted the lid slowly. The trunk was filled with old letters, legal documents, and yellowed photographs. At first glance, they appeared ordinary, the usual remnants of a family's past. But Miss Marple knew better. She lifted a bundle of letters tied with a blue ribbon, her fingers careful and deliberate. The handwriting was elegant but faded. "These are personal," she murmured, glancing over them. "Love letters, I should think." Eleanor flushed. I hadn't read them. They belonged to my great-aunt, I believe." Miss Marple set them aside, returning to the trunk's contents. She sifted gently through the documents, pausing when her fingers brushed against a thick, folded piece of parchment tucked between two books. She pulled it out carefully. It was an old will. The moment she saw the name Geoffrey Lonsdale, she knew they had found what the intruder was looking for. Graves peered over her shoulder. "What is that?" Miss Marple unfolded the document. "I believe, dear Inspector, that this is the original will of Colonel Lonsdale." Eleanor gasped. But my solicitor already provided me with my uncle's will. That's how I inherited Greythorn House." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, dear, but I suspect this is a very different version from the one your solicitor gave you." She turned the document toward them. The ink was faded but still legible. And there, written in clear script, was the name of another heir. Miss Marple's voice was calm but certain. "It appears, dear Eleanor, that you may not be the rightful heir, after all." A stunned silence filled the attic. Eleanor's face paled. But that means," Inspector Graves scowled. "It means someone knew about this before you did, and they were willing to break into your house to find it." Miss Marple, still holding the will delicately, looked between them. "I rather think, dear Inspector, that we should find out who else has been asking questions about this house lately." Graves snapped his notebook shut. "I'll question the solicitor." Miss Marple's gaze drifted back to the trunk, to the letters and documents now scattered across the attic floor. She had a feeling this was only the beginning. And somewhere in the village, the true heir, or the person determined to hide them, was waiting. Chapter 3. The weight of the newfound will settled heavily in the attic air. Eleanor Pritchard, still clutching the old trunk for support, stared at the document with undisguised shock. "But that's impossible," she whispered. "I was told. My uncle left Greythorn House to me. The solicitor reviewed everything before I came here." Miss Marple smiled gently, though her eyes remained sharp. "Yes, dear, but it does seem that an earlier will was overlooked." Inspector Graves, who had been reading the document over Miss Marple's shoulder, exhaled sharply. "And not by accident, I'd wager. Someone wanted this version of the will to disappear." Eleanor shook her head, dazed. "But who?" Miss Marple carefully folded the document, tapping it lightly against her fingers. "That, my dear, is the question, isn't it?" A long pause stretched between them. The attic, filled with the dust of forgotten years, suddenly seemed much more alive with hidden intentions. Graves motioned toward the door. "We should take this downstairs. I need to speak to your solicitor, Miss Pritchard, and see exactly how much he knew, or didn't know." Eleanor, still struggling to process the implications, nodded absently and followed them down the creaking wooden stairs. As they stepped into the drawing-room, Mrs. Webb, Eleanor's housekeeper, appeared at the doorway, looking visibly distressed. "Oh, Miss Eleanor!" she gasped, wringing her hands. "There's a gentleman here asking for you." Eleanor frowned. "A gentleman?" Miss Marple's eyebrows lifted slightly. "Now, that is interesting." Mrs. Webb nodded hastily. "Yes, ma'am. He says he's from your uncle's law firm, a Mr. Harold Edmonds." Graves and Miss Marple exchanged a swift glance. "Show him in," Graves instructed. Moments later, A tall, thin man with neatly combed gray hair entered the room. His dark overcoat was still speckled with rain from the morning drizzle, and he carried a leather briefcase tightly under his arm. "Miss Pritchard," he greeted, his voice polite but formal. "I do apologize for arriving unannounced, but there's a matter of some urgency." Miss Marple, ever the picture of pleasant patience, took her seat near the fireplace, her knitting resting lightly on her lap. "Do go on, Mr. Edmonds. We were just discussing a rather curious matter ourselves." Edmonds hesitated, glancing warily at Graves. I have been reviewing Colonel Lonsdale's legal documents. Something was troubling me, and I felt it was best to address the issue in person." Eleanor stiffened. "You mean the will?" Edmonds blinked, his surprise poorly concealed. "You know about that?" Graves folded his arms. "We just found an older version in the attic." A look of genuine concern passed over Edmonds's face. "Then I fear we have uncovered the same discrepancy." He pulled out a bundle of official-looking papers and set them down on the table. "This is a copy of the final version of Colonel Lonsdale's will, the one you were presented with, Miss Pritchard." Eleanor leaned forward, her fingers trembling as she leafed through the document. Miss Marple, watching closely, noticed how Edmonds's eyes flickered toward the older will, the one still resting beside Graves. "My dear sir," she said pleasantly, "you seem rather surprised to see this version. Did you not know of its existence?" Edmonds hesitated for just a fraction too long. "No," he said at last. I was told there were no other copies." Miss Marple nodded, as if she believed him entirely. But she did not. Graves, sensing the same unease, cut in. "Mr. Edmonds, I need to ask you plainly, was this older will deliberately hidden?" Edmonds exhaled slowly, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve. "I don't know for certain, but when I was reviewing Colonel Lonsdale's records, I discovered that some of the original legal drafts were missing. Documents that should have been filed away were simply gone." Eleanor's voice wavered. "Gone?" Miss Marple, ever observant, watched as Mr. Edmonds tightened his grip on his briefcase. "Perhaps," she murmured, "you have an idea of who might have removed them?" Edmonds swallowed. "If I had to guess, the only person with access at the time was Mr. Lionel Marchbanks." Eleanor's eyes widened. "My solicitor?" Graves straightened. "And where is this Mr. Marchbanks now?" Edmonds hesitated. "That's the problem. He vanished 2 days ago." A cold silence fell over the room. Miss Marple, whose knitting needles had stilled, tilted her head ever so slightly. "My dear Mr. Edmonds," she said, "I do believe you've just introduced a new mystery into our little puzzle," Graves muttered under his breath. "A missing solicitor and a hidden will. Just what we needed." Miss Marple, however, looked rather pleased. "Yes, dear Inspector," she said, with a small smile. "But don't you see? The answer to one is very likely the answer to the other." Chapter 4. The room fell into heavy silence at Mr. Edmonds's revelation. A missing solicitor and a hidden will. It was all becoming too coincidental to be anything but deliberate. Inspector Graves, whose irritation had only deepened, snapped, his notebook shut. "You're telling me that Lionel Marchbanks, the very man responsible for handling the legal affairs of Colonel Lonsdale's estate, has disappeared?" Mr. Edmonds adjusted his cuffs, looking slightly uncomfortable under the weight of the room's collective scrutiny. "I wouldn't say disappeared, Inspector, but rather, he has become unreachable. He hasn't been seen in his office, and his clerk says he left abruptly 2 days ago without giving notice." Miss Marple, her fingers poised delicately over her knitting, gave a soft hum of consideration. How very peculiar. And tell me, dear Mr. Edmonds, when exactly did you first become aware of these irregularities in Colonel Lonsdale's legal affairs? Edmonds hesitated, just for a fraction of a second too long. A few days ago, when I began reviewing the older records. Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled faintly. Ah, and did you, perhaps, discuss your concerns with Mr. Marchbanks before he vanished? A muscle in Edmonds's jaw twitched slightly. Well, yes. I reached out to him regarding the missing documents, but I was told he was unavailable. That was before I realized he had left town. Graves exhaled sharply. So either Marchbanks ran off with this mess hanging over his head, or something, or someone, forced him to go silent. Miss Marple, never one for needless alarm, simply inclined her head. Quite so, Inspector. Eleanor Pritchard, who had remained unusually quiet through the exchange, suddenly spoke up, her voice laced with unease. You don't suppose something happened to him, do you? Miss Marple turned toward her with a kind but measured gaze. That, my dear, is precisely what we must determine. A tense silence followed before Graves pushed back his chair. Right. We need to track down Marchbanks. If he's still in the area, someone in this village will have seen him. Mr. Edmonds cleared his throat. I might be able to assist with that. I did a bit of inquiring myself this morning before coming here. I was told that Marchbanks was seen near the Old Mill Road 2 nights ago. Miss Marple smiled faintly. Oh, how very interesting. The Old Mill Road, you say? Eleanor frowned. But that road leads to Hawthorne Cottage. There's nothing else out there, except trees and fields. Graves scowled. And yet, that's where he was last seen. Miss Marple's fingers paused over her knitting, and she looked toward the window as though considering something unseen. My dear Inspector, she said finally, I do believe it might be worth taking a small trip down the Old Mill Road, don't you? Graves grunted. Might as well see if we can dig up anything useful. Miss Marple nodded pleasantly and rose from her chair. Oh, yes, dear. I rather think we will. The sky had begun to darken by the time they set off toward the Old Mill Road, the fading afternoon light casting long shadows across the narrow dirt path. The countryside surrounding St. Mary Mead had always held a certain charm, but today, with the weight of missing men and hidden documents, there was something ominous in the air. Miss Marple, seated beside Eleanor in the inspector's motor car, took in the passing landscape with keen, thoughtful eyes. I do wonder, Eleanor, she mused, if you ever heard your uncle mention this cottage before? Eleanor, still visibly unsettled by the events of the day, shook her head slowly. I don't think so. It wasn't part of the estate, as far as I know. Graves, who was driving, scoffed. A lawyer vanishing near an out-of-the-way cottage on the same week an old will turns up? It's not a coincidence. Miss Marple's smile was faint. Oh, no, dear Inspector. I rather think it isn't. As they rounded a bend in the road, Hawthorne Cottage came into view, a small, weathered house with ivy creeping up the stone walls and windows that looked as if they had not been opened in quite some time. Graves pulled the car to a stop. Well, let's see what we find. The trio stepped onto the gravel path leading up to the cottage. There were no lights in the windows, no signs of movement, but Miss Marple's sharp gaze flickered toward the door. It was slightly ajar. Prativert swore under his breath. Looks like we're not the first ones here. Miss Marple nodded, calm but alert. Indeed, and I rather suspect we should tread carefully. Graves, ever the pragmatist, reached for the revolver at his hip before pushing the door open with measured caution. Inside, the air was stale, thick with dust, and the furniture looked as though it had not been disturbed for some time. But something was wrong. A half-packed bag sat on the wooden table, papers scattered beside it, as though someone had left in a hurry. Eleanor's breath hitched. Was he staying here? Graves moved toward the table, picking up a scrap of paper. His face darkened as he read it aloud. Too dangerous. They know. I have to leave before it's too late. Miss Marple stepped forward, her expression grave. Oh, dear, she murmured. It seems Mr. Marchbanks was running from something after all. Eleanor shivered. Or someone. Graves searched the room swiftly, but there was no sign of the solicitor. Well, if he was here, he's gone now. But this means someone wanted him silenced before he could say too much. Miss Marple fingered the edge of the note carefully. The ink was still fresh, meaning it had been written very recently. She turned to Graves, her voice gentle but firm. My dear Inspector, I do believe Mr. Marchbanks is still very much alive. But if we don't find him soon— Her expression grew distant, as though seeing something far beyond the confines of the small, dusty cottage. I rather fear that he won't be for much longer. Chapter 5. The atmosphere in Hawthorne Cottage was thick with the weight of unfinished business. The room bore subtle signs of a hurried departure. A half-packed valise, a coat draped over a chair, papers scattered across the wooden table. It was clear that Lionel Marchbanks had left in a hurry. Inspector Graves, standing stiffly near the table, examined the note again. His jaw was tight. Too dangerous. They know. I have to leave before it's too late, he repeated grimly. That tells us two things. First, that Marchbanks wasn't working alone, and second, that someone, maybe more than one person, was after him. Miss Marple, who had been surveying the room with quiet intent, tilted her head slightly. Yes, dear Inspector, but the real question is, did he manage to escape? Or was he taken? Eleanor shuddered. You think he might be in danger? Miss Marple gave a small, gentle smile, though there was something deeply perceptive in her eyes. Oh, my dear, I rather think he was already in danger before he ever set foot in this cottage. Graves sighed heavily, rubbing a hand down his face. We need to find out who Marchbanks was running from. And if he's still alive, we need to find him. Fast. Miss Marple drifted toward the table, her gaze flitting across the scattered papers. Most were legal documents, ledgers, and letters, the remnants of a man who had spent his life handling other people's affairs. But one particular envelope, lying just beneath a stack of bills, caught her attention. She picked it up carefully. The wax seal had been broken, but it had once been marked with the Lonsdale family crest. Ah, she murmured. This is interesting. Eleanor, who had moved closer, frowned. What is it? Miss Marple opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of parchment, dated nearly 25 years ago. The ink was faded, but the words were still readable. Graves peered over her shoulder, eyes narrowing. A signed confession? Eleanor's breath hitched. Confession of what? Miss Marple's voice was calm, measured. It appears to be a document written by Colonel Geoffrey Lonsdale himself. He confesses that his rightful heir was not Eleanor Pritchard, but someone else entirely. The room went deathly silent. Eleanor staggered backward, her face pale. That's impossible. He left everything to me. Miss Marple folded the letter carefully. So you were told, dear, but it seems that the colonel may have wished to change his mind. Graves swore under his breath. If this letter got out, it could ruin everything. He turned to Eleanor. Do you know who this mystery heir might be? Eleanor shook her head vehemently. No, I don't know anything about this. If my uncle had another heir, he never mentioned it. Miss Marple studied Eleanor carefully, then nodded. Yes, dear. I rather think you may be telling the truth. Eleanor exhaled shakily, her fingers gripping the back of a chair. But that means whoever does know, whoever Marchbanks was running from, they knew the truth all along. Graves scowled, and they wanted to make sure it never saw the light of day. Miss Marple smoothed the fabric of her dress, her gaze returning to the letter. I do wonder, Inspector, how many people in this village were aware of the original will before it went missing? Graves gritted his teeth. Only a handful. Marchbanks, obviously. Maybe someone from the law firm. But if there's another heir out there, why haven't they come forward? Miss Marple's voice was soft, thoughtful. Perhaps they never knew. The realization settled heavily over the room. Eleanor, still shaken, ran a hand through her hair. If someone's gone to these lengths to cover this up, they won't stop now. We need to— A sudden thudding noise from outside cut her off. Everyone froze. Graves instinctively reached for his revolver, his eyes snapping toward the door. Stay here, he ordered. Miss Marple, however, had already turned toward the window. She peered out carefully, her eyes narrowing. I rather think, dear Inspector, that whoever is out there, they aren't running away. Graves didn't wait for more. He threw open the door and stepped out onto the overgrown garden path. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves, but beyond that there was a figure, hunched near the edge of the cottage, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees. Graves raised his revolver. You! Step forward! The figure staggered slightly, then, to everyone's shock, collapsed. Eleanor let out a small gasp. Miss Marple, calm but alert, took a small step forward, her hands folded, neatly in front of her. Oh dear! I rather think we found Mr. Marchbanks. Graves lowered his revolver, cursing under his breath. Marchbanks was alive, but barely. His clothes were torn, his face bruised, and his breath came raggedly. Miss Marple knelt beside him, her voice gentle but firm. Mr. Marchbanks, dear, can you hear me? The solicitor's eyes flickered open, his gaze dazed, unfocused. He tried to speak, but only a hoarse whisper escaped. Miss Marple leaned closer. It's quite all right, dear. Just tell us, who did this to you? Marchbanks' fingers trembled, clutching at Miss Marple's sleeve. His lips moved, but his voice was barely audible. Graves leaned down. Speak up, man. Marchbanks' breath rattled painfully, but finally, with great effort, he managed a single word. Hargrove. Eleanor stiffened. Miss Marple's expression remained calm, but her eyes flashed with something sharp and knowing. Graves's face darkened. Lady Hargrove? Marchbanks gave a weak nod before his head slumped back, unconscious. Eleanor shook her head rapidly. No, that's impossible. Lady Hargrove, she's always been kind to me. Miss Marple rose slowly, her gaze distant, thoughtful. Oh, my dear, she murmured, dusting off her skirts. Kindness, you see, is not the same as innocence. Chapter 6. The name Hargrove hung in the air like a storm cloud, settling over the small gathering outside Hawthorne Cottage with a weight that none of them could immediately shake. Eleanor shook her head in disbelief, her expression one of complete shock. Lady Hargrove, she whispered. No, It, it must be a mistake. Why would she have anything to do with this? Miss Marple, who had been gazing pensively at the unconscious Lionel Marchbanks, merely gave a small, thoughtful nod. "Oh, my dear, it is a rather curious accusation, isn't it? But Mr. Marchbanks used the very last of his strength to say that name. One does wonder why." Inspector Graves straightened, his jaw set. "It's time we paid Lady Hargrove a visit." Eleanor still looked deeply unsettled, but she nodded slowly. "Yes, yes, I think we must." Miss Marple smiled gently, though her mind was already several steps ahead. "Quite right, dear. But I would suggest that we do not accuse her too quickly. After all, people with secrets tend to hold them tightly until they feel safe enough to speak." With that, they helped Marchbanks into the inspector's motor car, his breath still shallow and uneven, before setting off for Hargrove Manor. Lady Hargrove's estate loomed over the landscape with an air of aged nobility, its grand stone facade betraying nothing of the secrets that had been whispered within its walls. The housekeeper, a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Tilling, opened the door, eyeing the unexpected visitors warily. "Her ladyship is not expecting visitors," she said stiffly. Inspector Graves, never one for politeness when he was being stalled, simply stepped past her. "She'll see us." The drawing-room at Hargrove Manor was immaculately arranged, the fire burning low in the hearth, casting soft golden light against the deep mahogany paneling. And there, seated near the window with a crystal glass of sherry in hand, was Lady Hargrove herself. She was a woman of refined elegance, though Miss Marple noted the slight tightness in her posture, the way her fingers tensed around the stem of her glass just slightly when she saw them. "What a surprise," Lady Hargrove said smoothly, though her tone was a shade too practiced. "To what do I owe this unexpected visit?" Graves wasted no time. "We just came from Hawthorne Cottage." A small flicker of something passed through Lady Hargrove's eyes, so fast that most would have missed it. Miss Marple, of course, did not. "Hawthorne Cottage?" Lady Hargrove repeated with mild curiosity. "That's rather an abandoned little place, isn't it?" Graves's gaze hardened. "Not as abandoned as you might think." Miss Marple, ever the picture of gentle patience, lowered herself into an armchair, smoothing her skirt. "Oh, but dear Lady Hargrove, I do think you know that already." Lady Hargrove laughed lightly, though the sound was slightly brittle. "Miss Marple, I always admire your sharpness, but I'm afraid I haven't the faintest idea what you mean." Miss Marple smiled sweetly, her fingers folding neatly over her handbag. "No, dear? Then I suppose you also do not know that Lionel Marchbanks was found there this evening, badly injured and quite desperate to escape." A flicker of alarm crossed Lady Hargrove's otherwise poised expression. Eleanor, still looking as though she were barely keeping up with events, leaned forward. "Lady Hargrove, he said your name, just before he lost consciousness. He was afraid of you." Lady Hargrove's glass clinked slightly as she set it down on the table beside her. "Well," she murmured, "that is unfortunate." Graves's patience was wearing thin. "So why would he say your name, Lady Hargrove?" For a brief moment, the room was so silent that the crackling of the fire seemed louder than usual. Then, with an exhale, Lady Hargrove did something unexpected. She laughed softly. "My dear Inspector," she said, reaching for her pearls and adjusting them delicately, "do you truly believe I had something to do with a solicitor fleeing for his life?" Graves folded his arms. "I believe you know more than you're letting on." Miss Marple's expression did not change, but she watched carefully as Lady Hargrove reached for her sherry again. Lady Hargrove took a slow sip. Then, as if she had made some quiet decision, she set the glass down once more. "You are correct in assuming that I knew about the original will," she said at last. Eleanor gasped. "Then you knew my uncle had intended to leave Greythorn House to someone else?" Lady Hargrove tilted her head slightly, the firelight catching in her sharp blue eyes. "Oh, Eleanor, dear, I knew far more than that." Silence. Miss Marple's expression remained soft. "Go on, dear." Lady Hargrove inhaled deeply, her gaze drifting toward the fire. "Colonel Lonsdale was a man of many regrets," she murmured. "And before he passed, he tried to right one of his greatest wrongs." Miss Marple nodded encouragingly. "The child." Eleanor's eyes widened. "Child?" Lady Hargrove gave a small, knowing smile. "Oh, yes, my dear. There was another heir. A child born long before you, before even your mother. But the colonel, ever proud and stubborn, kept the truth buried." Graves exhaled sharply. "Who was it?" Lady Hargrove met his gaze evenly. "A son." A stunned silence followed. Miss Marple, calm and composed, merely nodded. "Yes, I rather suspected as much." Eleanor's voice shook. "But then, where is he? Who is he?" Lady Hargrove's lips pressed together. "That I do not know. The colonel made attempts to find him before he died, but by then it was too late." Miss Marple's fingers tightened slightly over her handbag. "And so, dear Lady Hargrove, you chose to keep what you did know to yourself." Lady Hargrove gave a delicate shrug. "I saw no reason to disrupt Eleanor's inheritance over a ghost from the past." Graves scowled. "And what about Marchbanks? Why did he end up half dead in a cottage?" Lady Hargrove's expression darkened. "I have no idea. But if he was attacked, I assure you, it wasn't by me." Miss Marple studied her carefully. "No, dear. But perhaps it was by someone else who had just as much to lose if the truth were revealed." A sudden thought flickered across Eleanor's face. Her voice barely above a whisper, she said, "Then, whoever hurt Marchbanks, they must know the truth, too." Miss Marple's smile was small, but knowing. "Oh, yes, dear. And that means they're still watching." Chapter 7. A chill settled over the drawing-room of Hargrove Manor. The revelation of Colonel Lonsdale's hidden son had changed everything, but it had also left them with more questions than answers. Somewhere, out there, was the rightful heir to Greythorn House, a person someone had tried desperately to erase from history. Inspector Graves, ever the pragmatist, rubbed his temples. "So let's get this straight. Colonel Lonsdale had a son. He was hidden or forgotten, perhaps deliberately. Lionel Marchbanks discovered something about him, and before he could reveal it, someone tried to silence him." Lady Hargrove, still seated near the fire, remained composed, though her eyes flickered toward Miss Marple. "If that's true, Inspector, then you should be asking yourselves something else entirely." Graves frowned. "What's that?" Lady Hargrove's lips curved slightly. "Not just who the heir is, but who benefits from making sure no one ever finds him." A heavy pause followed. Miss Marple, seated gracefully with her hands folded over, her knitting, gave a small nod. "Oh, yes, dear. That is precisely the question, isn't it?" Eleanor, who had been silent since Lady Hargrove's admission, clutched her arms around herself, as if bracing against some unseen force. But what if this heir doesn't even know who they are? What if they've been living their whole life without any idea that they were meant to inherit Greythorn House? Miss Marple's blue eyes twinkled. "Yes, dear. That would make it all the more tragic, wouldn't it? Graves sighed, turning to Lady Hargrove. If the colonel tried to find his son before he died, then there must be records somewhere. Do you have any idea where he might have kept them? Lady Hargrove gave him a long, considering look before rising slowly from her chair. If there are any records, she said smoothly, they would be in his personal study at Greythorn House. Eleanor stiffened. But I've searched that room already. There's nothing there. Just old books, family ledgers, nothing important. Lady Hargrove arched a brow. Are you quite sure, dear? Eleanor faltered. I thought so. Miss Marple rose from her chair. Then I rather think we ought to have another look, don't you? The drive back to Greythorn House was silent. The weight of what they had just learned hung over them, pressing down like the storm clouds gathering on the horizon. Eleanor led the way inside, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the heavy door to her uncle's study. The room was just as she had left it. Dark mahogany shelves lined with old books, a large oak desk in the center, and an ornate grandfather clock ticking steadily in the corner. Graves let out an irritated sigh. It looks like any other study. To me. Miss Marple, however, did not rush. She stepped inside slowly, her sharp eyes scanning the room. She knew from experience that important things were rarely left in plain sight. They were hidden in the places people overlooked, disguised as something unimportant. She moved toward the bookshelves, her fingers trailing lightly across the spines. Tell me, Eleanor dear, she said thoughtfully, was your uncle a man of routine? Eleanor blinked. What do you mean? Miss Marple gave a gentle smile. Well, some men like their books arranged by subject. Others keep them exactly as they've always been, afraid to move anything out of place. And then, of course, there are those who use bookshelves for other purposes. Eleanor frowned, stepping beside her. I never noticed anything strange, Miss Marple hummed. Perhaps not. But let's see if your uncle left us a clue. She carefully pulled out a single book, its title barely visible from years of wear. The Lonsdale Family History. At first, nothing happened. But then, a soft click echoed through the room. Graves straightened immediately. What was that? Eleanor gasped as the section of bookshelf shifted inward, revealing a hidden compartment. Miss Marple smiled gently. Oh, how very clever of him. Inside the compartment was a bundle of aged papers, bound with a frayed red ribbon. Eleanor reached for them with shaking hands, her breath catching as she read the first page. It's, she whispered, it's his letters. Letters to someone named Samuel Everett. Miss Marple's expression did not change, though a certain knowing glint appeared in her eyes. Ah, and does that name mean anything to you, dear? Eleanor shook her head. No, I've never heard of him before. Graves stepped forward, scanning the pages. If these letters are what they appear to be, then this Samuel Everett may be the missing heir. Eleanor pressed a hand over her mouth, trying to steady herself. But if that's true, where is he? Miss Marple exhaled softly. Oh, my dear, that is precisely what someone has gone to great lengths to keep us from finding out. Graves turned to her. What do you mean? Miss Marple's voice was gentle, yet firm. I mean, Inspector, that if Mr. Everett were still alive, he would have come forward by now. A cold silence fell over the room. Eleanor staggered slightly, her mind racing. You think he's dead? Miss Marple's lips pressed together. I fear that is a very real possibility. Graves swore under his breath. Then We need to find out what happened to him. If he was the rightful heir and someone knew it, then a loud crash from outside cut him off. Everyone froze. Graves instantly reached for his revolver, while Eleanor's face went pale. Miss Marple, however, merely straightened her shoulders, her expression calm, yet watchful. "My dear Inspector," she murmured, "I do believe we have a visitor." Chapter 8. A sharp gust of wind rattled the windows as the sound of the crash echoed through the study. Inspector Graves was already moving, his revolver drawn as he strode toward the door. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, her hands clenched, tightly at her sides. Miss Marple, however, remained seated, her hands neatly folded over the stack of old letters. She tilted her head slightly, listening, her expression one of quiet contemplation. Graves peered into the hallway, his posture tense. "Stay here," he muttered before disappearing into the corridor. Eleanor hesitated for only a moment before rushing to the window, her breath hitched. "Miss Marple, someone's out there." Miss Marple joined her at the window. The gardens below were shadowed in the dim glow of the fading afternoon light, but there, near the hedge line, was a figure, a man, half hidden, in the mist, moving hurriedly away from the house. Eleanor's pulse quickened. "That's him, isn't it? That's who's been watching us." Miss Marple's blue eyes narrowed slightly, taking in the hunched posture, the careful steps. "Oh, I rather think it is." Without another word, Eleanor bolted for the door, but Miss Marple stopped her with a gentle hand on her arm. "Patience, dear. Desperate men do desperate things." Graves returned just as Eleanor struggled against Miss Marple's hold. "There's no one inside," he muttered, then noticed their expressions. "What is it?" Eleanor pointed. "Out. There. By the hedges. He's getting away," Graves cursed, dashing for the door. Miss Marple turned back to the window, watching as the shadowed figure moved faster now, slipping toward the road leading out of the estate. He knew he'd been spotted. He knew it was only a matter of time, and that, Miss Marple knew, was when people made mistakes. Graves's heavy boots pounded down the hallway, but Miss Marple's voice, calm and unwavering, stopped him mid-step. "Inspector!" Graves whipped around, breathless. "What?" Miss Marple adjusted the cuff of her sleeve, then said, with absolute certainty, "He won't go far. Not when he's spent so much time watching." Eleanor stared at her. "What do you mean?" Miss Marple's smile was faint, but knowing. "Oh, my dear, he won't run. He's come too close now to give up. No, he's not trying to escape. He's leading us." Graves narrowed his eyes. "Leading us where?" Miss Marple turned back, to the window. The man was disappearing into the trees now, slipping through the small wooded path beyond the garden, to wherever it is that Samuel Everett's fate was decided. Eleanor shivered. "You think he knows what happened to him?" Miss Marple's voice was gentle, but firm. "I rather think he's the reason Samuel Everett disappeared at all." Graves clenched his jaw. "Then, let's go get him." Miss Marple rose gracefully, adjusting her coat. "Oh, yes, dear. I rather think it's time we got some answers." Chapter 9. The woods beyond Graythorn House were thick with shadows, the undergrowth damp beneath their hurried footsteps. A low fog clung to the ground, curling around the trees, making the figure ahead seem even more spectral as he moved, deeper into the forest. Inspector Graves, his revolver held firmly at his side, muttered under his breath as they followed. "If he's leading us into a trap, I swear." Miss Marple, keeping a steady but measured pace, simply smiled, faintly. Oh, I rather think he's leading us to something he fears we may soon find on our own. Eleanor, breathless but determined, whispered, Miss Marple, if this is about Samuel Everett, does that mean we're walking into a burial site? A chill ran through the air, though whether it was the wind or the gravity of her words, no one could tell. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled, unreadable. Perhaps, dear, or perhaps we are about to learn that some secrets refuse to stay buried at all. Ahead, the figure stumbled, his foot catching on a root, sending him sprawling forward. Onto the damp earth, a sharp curse escaped him, his palms skidding over wet leaves as he scrambled back to his feet. Graves surged forward. Stop! Stay where you are! The man froze, his shoulders heaving, before slowly turning to face them. The flickering glow of the inspector's torch illuminated his haggard face, the wild look in his eyes, the sweat on his brow. He was middle-aged, with sharp features weathered by time, but his expression, more than anything, spoke of pure fear. Eleanor let out a gasp. That's Mr. Redford. He used to work for my uncle. Miss Marple, her gaze piercing, tilted her head. Ah, a former groundskeeper, I presume. The man, Redford, said nothing. His chest rose and fell rapidly, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. Graves stepped forward. We know you've been watching Graythorn House. We know you ransacked the attic. And now, here you are, leading us into the woods. So start talking, Redford. Still, he said nothing. Miss Marple took a small step closer, her voice soft but insistent. I rather think, dear Mr. Redford, that you already know why we're here. You see, we found the letters. A sharp flinch, his breathing hitched, but still he remained silent. Eleanor stepped forward, her voice wavering but strong. Samuel Everett. You know what happened to him, don't you? Redford's gaze flickered, but his lips remained tightly pressed together. Graves, ever the pragmatist, lifted his revolver slightly. You can either tell us here, or we'll take you down to the station, where I'll be far less patient. Finally, Redford spoke. His voice was hoarse, strained, as though the words themselves pained him. I didn't kill him. A pause. A long, heavy silence filled the woods. Miss Marple's expression remained serene. But you know who did, don't you? Redford licked his lips, eyes darting around as if the trees themselves might be listening. I swear, I never meant for any of it to happen, he whispered. I only did what I was told. Eleanor shuddered. By whom? Another pause. Then, his voice barely above a whisper. Lady Hargrove. The name hung in the air, settling over them like an inescapable weight. Eleanor staggered backward. No, that can't be true. Graves's jaw tightened. She already admitted she knew about the missing heir. But you're telling us she did more than just cover it up? Redford swallowed hard. I was just a boy when I started working on the estate, he said, his voice trembling. I did what I was told. She said there was someone who had to disappear. A man who would ruin everything if he stayed. I didn't know at first. Not really. But then I saw it happen. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, unwavering. Saw what, dear? Redford's hands shook violently. They took him. In the middle of the night. Marchbanks was there. Not willingly, I don't think. He looked sick about it. But Lady Hargrove, she was the one in control. She told him that it was for the good of the family. Eleanor wrapped her arms around herself, her breath coming in short, uneven gasps. What did they do? Redford hesitated. Then, with great reluctance, he turned and pointed toward the far end of the clearing, where the ground sloped gently downward into the remains of an old well, long forgotten among the trees. Miss Marple, ever composed, did not look away. "I see," she murmured. Eleanor clutched her throat, as if struggling to breathe. "No, no, it's not possible." Graves, his expression dark, turned to his constable. "Get a team out here. Now!" Redford's voice cracked. "I swear, I didn't do it. I only helped cover it up. She told me he was a liar, that he'd ruin everything. I was young, and I believed her. But I didn't know they would." He swallowed hard. "She told me it was done, that he was gone for good." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Ah, but the past, dear Mr. Redford, has a way of resurfacing, just like the truth." Eleanor was trembling now, her entire world shattering around her. She knew all this time. She let me live in that house, knowing. Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on Eleanor's arm, grounding her. "Yes, dear, but now the truth is no longer hidden." Graves gave Redford a long, hard look. "You're coming with us." Redford did not resist. He simply stared at the well, his face ashen. "She'll never admit it," he muttered. "She'll lie until the end." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Oh, perhaps. But even the best liars slip, dear. And I rather think Lady Hargrove has already begun to unravel." As the constables led Redford away, Eleanor turned toward Miss Marple. "What now?" she whispered. Monsieur Marple looked toward the darkened trees, where the well stood silent and waiting. "Now, dear," she said softly, "we bring Samuel Everett home." Chapter 10. The night air was thick with silence as the police worked to excavate the well's long-forgotten secrets. The woods surrounding Greythorn House had once been a place of quiet beauty, but now they bore witness to a crime buried beneath decades of deception. Miss Marple stood calmly near the edge of the clearing, her hands folded over the handle of her handbag. She had seen many such moments before. The past unearthing itself at last, refusing to remain hidden forever. Eleanor stood beside her, pale but resolute. Her gaze never wavered from the well, as though staring at it long enough might somehow rewrite the terrible truth that had come to light. Inspector Graves emerged from the trees, his face dark with confirmation. He met Miss Marple's gaze and gave a grim nod. "They found him," he said simply. A hushed silence followed. The wind stirred the leaves, whispering through the trees like the voice of a long-lost memory. Eleanor let out a shaky breath, pressing a hand to her chest. "So it's true," she murmured. "Samuel Everett was here all along." Miss Marple sighed softly. "Yes, dear. And someone went to great lengths to ensure he never left." Graves exhaled sharply. "Redford's story checks out. The remains were buried deep, but there's no doubt it's him." He shook his head. "A man wiped from history, just so someone else could hold on to an inheritance." Eleanor's voice was small, but steady. "Lady Hargrove." Miss Marple nodded, gently. "Yes, dear." A heavy silence fell between them. Then, as if on cue, the distant rumble of a motor car broke through the night air. The glow of approaching headlights bathed the clearing in golden light as a police vehicle pulled to a stop on the narrow path. The door opened, and out stepped Lady Hargrove, her regal composure untouched, even as her eyes flickered toward the scene before her. Two constables stood at attention, but she did not look at them. Instead, she turned to Miss Marple, her lips curving in something that might have been amusement, if not for the coldness behind it. "Well," she said lightly, "I suppose I should have expected this." Eleanor tensed beside Miss Marple, her hands clenching into fists. "You knew," she whispered, her voice trembling with anger and grief. "You knew all along." Lady Hargrove's expression did not change. "Of course I knew, my dear. How could I not?" Eleanor let out a shuddering breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "And you let me believe I belonged there. You let me take Graythorn House, knowing it wasn't mine." Lady Hargrove let out a small, unbothered sigh. "It was yours," she said simply, "because I made sure it was." Inspector Graves stepped forward, his jaw set. "You ordered the murder of Samuel Everett. You had him taken in the middle of the night, buried in that well like an inconvenience. And then you covered it up, didn't you?" Lady Hargrove tilted her head slightly. "Oh, Inspector. Such a dramatic way of putting things." Eleanor stared at her, aghast. "You don't even deny it?" Lady Hargrove turned to her, and for the first time that night, a crack appeared in her mask of cold indifference. "Deny it?" she echoed. "Why should I? What difference would it make now?" Miss Marple watched her carefully, noting the smallest shift in her demeanor. Not fear, not regret, but something close to relief. "Ah," Miss Marple murmured. "How interesting." Lady Hargrove's eyes flickered toward her. "What is?" Miss Marple smiled, soft but unyielding. "You don't look afraid, dear. You look relieved." A tense pause followed. Then Lady Hargrove let out a soft, breathless laugh. "Well," she said, "perhaps I am." Eleanor staggered back, her expression twisting with disbelief. "You're a monster." Lady Hargrove tilted her head. "Am I? Or am I simply someone who refused to let a mistake dictate the rest of my life?" She exhaled, slowly, her gaze flickering toward the well. Samuel Everett was an inconvenience. He would have unraveled everything. So I did what I had to do. Miss Marple folded her hands together neatly. "And now, dear, I rather think you'll have to face the consequences of that choice." Graves motioned to the constables. "Lady Hargrove, I'm placing you under arrest for the murder of Samuel Everett and the obstruction of justice." Lady Hargrove turned toward him, unbothered, as if the reality of her fate had long since settled upon her shoulders. She held out her wrists, allowing them to be bound. "I suppose it was always going to end this way," she mused. Miss Marple studied her. "Yes, dear. The past never stays hidden forever. It simply waits for the right moment to return." Lady Hargrove's smile was small, almost wistful. "Yes, I imagine you would know that better than most." With that, she was led away, disappearing into the night like the very secrets she had so desperately tried to bury. The moment she was gone, Eleanor let out a sharp, unsteady breath, her entire body trembling with the weight of what had just transpired. Miss Marple rested a gentle hand on her arm. "It will take time, dear." Eleanor swallowed hard. "I don't know what to do now." Miss Marple smiled kindly. "You will decide what to do with Graythorn House, but more importantly, you will choose who you want to be, now that the truth is yours." Eleanor's eyes glistened, but she nodded slowly. Miss Marple turned toward Graves, who was watching her with something between exasperation and admiration. "You know," he muttered, shaking his head, "I don't know how you do it, Miss Marple." Miss Marple smiled sweetly. "Oh, Inspector, it's quite simple, really. She looked toward the darkened estate, the ghosts of the past finally laid to rest. One only has to listen.